Hello, everyone. Welcome to the October 18th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting with Steven Becker, our President and COO. I think this is our 12th episode. I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to hand it over to Steven almost immediately to give us a recap of last week and talk about what we're going to get into this week. But I want to point out that one of our keenest members, David Utrobin, has suggested recently that he's getting into too many traffic near misses by trying to watch YouTube videos on his way back to work. And so why don't we make a podcast version of these calls? And I thought that was a genius idea, and that's exactly what I did. So there's an audio-only version of the entire series up on SoundCloud right now that I should have. What's that?
I said, good show. Well done.
Yeah, it was a great idea from David. So I tested it out yesterday, and it was a great opportunity to actually get a refresher of a lot of the things that we've talked about from the beginning during the daily walk. So I'll post a link in our chat here, and I'll make sure that that's reflected in our subreddit. And maybe even when I post the YouTube video, we'll add links to the SoundCloud so people don't need to be stuck to their computers while they're watching these things. All right, I think that's it for my updates. So, Steven, if you want to take it away.
Sure. So, to recap, the last time we were on the community call, we were looking at various risk parameters, but we focused mostly on what governance is and what governance means. Because I think the one thing I'm trying to drive home over and over again is that the MKR token is a governance token. And the way we can wrap our head around what that means is obviously the first part being, what can you do with it? You can vote. But just voting on proposals in the direction of a system is only a small part of it. What really is a greater part is how you ideally manifest value through the proposals that you're considering. How you want to grow the system, and how you want MKR to actually have a value that is representative of your voting rights and your voting capability. Now, I remember talking about how you can hold MKR tokens, and this is very important to consider because it goes back to the voting mechanism and how we understand the voting mechanism. So, we all know that there's two different types of votes. There's your governance vote and your executive vote. And the reason that you have a governance vote before an executive vote is so that you can increase the confidence in the executive vote actually being approved and the underlying state being deployed to the blockchain. But what we didn't highlight is where should you hold your MKR tokens? Theoretically, you should put them in one of two places. MKR tokens should always be either in the voting structure, because you are always required to be cognizant of what's going on in the system and assessing and evaluating the proposals that are in the system. The idea is that, in theory, you should have a continuous deluge of proposals. And each of these proposals should have an inherent value to the system that everyone needs to consider. And we'll be considering them through social media, all the way through to a governance vote. And
there's a name for that. It's called approval or continuous approval. Is that what it's called?
Yes. No. This is the continuous approval voting system, where you, as I said, you have this continuous deluge of proposals with which you need to assess the underlying value, and then you obviously need to select which ones you want to incorporate in the system. But that's for the executive side. The continuous approval voting is for the executive vote. It's basically how you actually want to go about changing the state of the system. Now, that's one place you can put your MKR tokens. If you have found that the proposals that are coming in do not have any new material value or do not have any value whatsoever, then one would basically assume that the value of MKR would be stagnant for that time being. So the next place you want to keep your MKR is in the liquidity pool. In my mind, that means you want to turn MKR into DAI. The reason being is that you want to sustain the store of value that you have in MKR. You might find that you'll be exposed to the volatility of MKR and you don't wish to, and you feel that the additional value in the proposals will not outstrip the inline volatility of MKR. So the best idea would be to, go into DAI and keep your store of value there, or whatever other sort of liquidity trajectory you wish to take. But in principle, those are the two places you should be keeping your MKR token, or at least the value of your MKR token. The third one, and this is pretty much what everyone is pretty much doing right now, is you're keeping your MKR tokens in your wallet. Now, theoretically, you shouldn't be keeping it in your wallet. You should either be in DAI or you should be in the voting structure. But the only reason you want to keep your MKR token in the wallet is when you do not have the liquidity and fluidity of the secondary market working for you nicely, when you don't believe that you can actually transfer all your value of MKR into DAI appropriately. Or on the other side, you decide that the voting construct you still need to get used to. It doesn't really appeal to your high standards of security, or maybe you still need to try and figure out what that security is and really get used to it. The point being is there are these natural frictions in both the voting structure and in the liquidity pool. And those frictions will then induce some folks to maybe keep their MKR in their own wallets. But ultimately, without those frictions, there's only really two places you need to be in MKR, either in the voting construct or in DAI, where you have a store of value. Why am I talking about this? The reason I am mentioning this is because if you ultimately want to find out what the true value of an MKR token is, which represents governance, which represents your ability to vote, those two mechanisms will always be headbutting against each other, and as a consequence, creating price discovery on what it means to vote. I mean, that is ultimately what I was trying to get at, and it behooves MKR token holders to be constantly cognizant of this process, because the continuous approval voting system does not have a quorum. And the reason it does not have a quorum to pass a proposal is that it is an incentive for everyone to participate. Because if you do not participate, there is a chance that a proposal could pass that does not have a proper representation, or what you'd consider a proper representation of the entire system.
Well, that's interesting. I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So you're saying that it should be either sitting in DAI, or it should be in the voting system, or potentially in your wallet if you want to maintain some flexibility. But ultimately, the price discovery in this model is the price of Maker is at that point where people don't find it worthwhile to actually lock it up into the voting system, and they're leaving it on the exchange. So that's the balance that it needs to reach.
So most folks might be in the voting construct and they're looking at all these proposals coming in and they're thinking, no, these proposals are not going to create value that's going to surpass the underlying volatility of MKR price discovery. So they think, I don't want to sit here and actually be exposed to this volatility while I wait for better proposals to come along. So you go into DAI and you keep your store of value in DAI. You obviously be cognizant of what's going on in the system if you wish to be, and then when you do see new proposals come, maybe new collateral types that could clearly expand the generation of DAI, you think now is the time to get back in. I get it, and you get back in. Now, obviously, there's going to be a certain amount of market risk that you have from getting out and getting back in, but that option is there. The construct is there. The forces acting against each other is very clear, and that's where the dynamic is. And the result of that dynamic is actually valuing the state of the system in terms of your voting power and how you can unlock further value in proposals. That literally is the underlying dynamic for being a part of the MKR governance. But the most important part about this is that it is governance. You have to continuously be involved with this. And that lack of quorum is the incentive to make sure that you do stay engaged. A lot of people might think, oh, that's quite a bit of, time of my life. Why must I constantly be looking at something and constantly worried? Well, unfortunately, that's where the process is, and that's where the process works. And your level of engagement is very similar to how you see different folks out there with their differing incentives as to why they want to get into a capital asset of sort. Everyone has their own profiles to which they have to bring to bear on their choices. This is no different.
Do you think that we're going to see sort of an emergence of a demographic, like clearly defined demographics in maker holders, where perhaps the retail CDP users, retail ecosystem participants are less interested in locking up their maker long term, whereas large investors like the A16Zs or the people that are representing payroll funds might choose instead to keep their maker locked up always?
The one aspect there is really having an opinion on where DAI is going to asymptote out in terms of its supply. That's really the underlying factor. If you do not see that a proposal can give you the opportunity to generate more DAI, then you're sitting back and saying, okay, well, are we at an asymptote or are we just at a lull? If we are at an asymptote, I mean, a question I had the other day is, are we like the central bank? Do we have a multiplier effect? And the answer is no. If you really want to get this in your head very clearly, it's pretty simple. You just think about this thought experiment. Imagine there is no other collateral out there except ETH, right? And imagine all ETH is put into a CDP. At most, all you're going to be able to take out is 66% of value of that ETH. But you can't go and take out that value and buy more ETH. There isn't any more ETH. You've used it all. So the natural function of the system is actually to remain complete and consistent. So if you had to use that thought experiment, you would actually reduce the value that is in the system. But because we're looking at growing an economy, that 66% extraction of value, you could quite easily use to go and flywheel a new organization, finance a new operation, get assets going, and by definition, grow the economy. So these aspects, you've got to really sort of keep in mind and realize that at a fundamental level, this all boils down to where you see the supply of DAI being now and in the future. And if you can see a material difference, then there's a reason to be a part of the maker governance.
Okay, thanks for that. Tom, you had a question you've typed in the side. I noticed you're on camera, though. Do you want to ask that for us?
Yeah, sure. So one question I had, I'm just wondering how to increase voting participation from smaller holders. Is there any way that you could envision maybe Maker rewarding those holding less Maker to vote and maybe not rewarding the larger holders just to give an incentive for people to vote on certain topics? Or is that a dumb idea?
No, that's a great idea. But the underlying assumption of that idea is that any proposal can pass, which fundamentally is the problem. And if someone brings in a proposal that says MakerDAO should be an ice cream factory, well, what will happen is if it does pass, MakerDAO will not become an ice cream factory. The governance security module will take over, identify that the proposal that is attempting to pass is detrimental to the system, and the system will shut down. So therefore, the proposals, and this is the most important part, is that the proposals need to be vetted appropriately, either from a rigorous point of view or from a clear alignment of incentives. So if you want to introduce a new oracle, then you say, okay, well, let's vote on this new oracle. But what does this mean? Where do they come from? How do they get their pricing? How are they going to stick around? Are we sure they're going to stick around? You're going to start weighing these guys up. So by the time you get to actually vote, you're going to have a clear idea about what you're voting about. So if you do have a proposal that somebody wants to sell motorbikes of a MakerDAO, again, it will be something that's against the system, and what you hope for is that the governance security module will catch that again. I think what I'm trying to get at is the basis of this is everything needs to be vetted from a rigorous point of view before it can actually be considered. It doesn't mean you can't put a proposal to sell lollipops, but it's going to be antithetical to the system. It's going to be identified as such, And if your proposal does get the critical mass, it'll shut the system down.
Got it. Thank you.
I think that Tom raised another interesting point that I think that people have been talking about, and this comes in waves. I think as people get interested in governance and MakerDAO, apathy becomes one of the major concerns, and then that inevitably leads to an incentivization mechanism. Is there a magic plan or game theoretical construct that we can use to force or encourage people to vote? And usually, as soon as I see those, I jump in almost immediately and say, like, that's doomed to fail. We can never do that in the nicest possible way. But every time that you incentivize a voting mechanism, in my experience, or from the things that I've seen in our space, you've created a profit motive for people to manipulate that system. And so you no longer need to be interested in MakerDAO or DAI or stability. You just need to be interested in showing a return off of manipulating a voting structure. And sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, the one thing that's really I find always interesting, and actually took me a while to get my head around it. When you think about voting, when you think about participating in an entity, there's always this counterparty construct in your head. It's me doing something in order to get someone else to do it. You always have that construct in your head, so therefore you think how best to get someone else to do something. Where in this system, this is one of the first iterations where you are completely responsible for absolutely everything. So if you want to get something done, you're actually convincing yourself, first and foremost. You're not convincing the board of directors. You're not convincing, you're not convincing an organization to change its point of view. You are quite literally convincing yourself. So that fiduciary responsibility actually sits with you. And the kind of confusing part about it is that it's got so many points where things can go wrong if you let it. And if you let it, it's your fault. It's not anyone else's fault. So it's a case of saying, well, we're all grown up, we're all adults, we all know where the system works and where it doesn't. So therefore, the responsibility is with us as MKR token holders. It's not, we're not going to go blame the board of directors if something goes wrong. We're not going to go blame management if something goes wrong, because there isn't a board of directors and there isn't management. There is just us as MKR token holders.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective, and I think that it's going to be fascinating to see how this shakes out, because, as you said, in a traditional vote, say you're voting for your local representative, you might have a limited expectation that that's going to have any positive impact on your life at any point in a regional election. But with the MakerDAO ecosystem, I think that we're going to see a huge cohort of people that are enormously interested in ensuring that their time and their investments and their stability is well maintained, and they're going to make sure that they have their eyes and their Maker tokens locked up so they can stop foolishness from happening before it's too late. So that might be the key to apathy, right?
The one thing everyone knows is that when you go to vote in your local or general election, the one thing you're always bearing in the back of your mind is really, at the end of the day, how does my vote count? Mm-hmm. And you're constantly trying to get a sense of what value it actually brings, what value it bears, and will it really make any difference whatsoever? Because it's very clear that's a basic premise of how people see voting. In MakerDAO, it basically is the same thing but on steroids. You really got to sit there and ask that question, not just to the point where you dismiss it and go either, oh well, I'm not worth anything, or actually I'm worth a lot. You need to have a look at it all the way down to the point where you're saying your 0.1 MKR or your 1 MKR effectively is going to unlock real value in a proposal. That's basically the mapping that you have. And that because the proposal is in effect created to make the best amount of sense for the system, your contribution is a step along with the mass of people looking for the same value in unleashing looking for the same value in the proposal. Where if you think about a normal general election, you don't get that sense because you do not know that that proposal or that candidate or whatever you're voting on for that matter actually has that rigorously vetted point of view that concludes with the fact that this is a value item for the system. You look at a candidate and you've got to basically be subjective yourself and say, well, he may bring or she may bring new ideas. That's all cool. I don't know. Effectively, you're going with a gut feel. In this space, everything boils down to a specific rigor, and that rigor should part and parcel convince a lot of people. And all you're doing is contributing to what is effectively a consensus in form. I don't know if that made sense. I hope it did.
No, I think it made sense for me, at least. If anybody else is confused, please ask questions in the chat. But so I think that that's an interesting point, that we're assuming that there's sort of a direct fiduciary responsibility, at least a self-interested one, which will cause people to remain engaged, especially large holders. But we also talk about, I don't know if this is official or like whether it's a plan, but we talk about delegated voting a lot as well when we're sort of conceiving about the future of the MakerDAO governance system. Would a delegated or delegating votes, would that be sort of how smaller holders would get representation in this system? Or is this to avoid, if somebody knows that they're engaged in the system, they know that they want to be, or they're engaged enough to want the system to succeed, but they can't necessarily or might not believe that they have the capacity to make intelligent risk-based decisions, and they decide to delegate their token. Is that still on the roadmap, or is that sort of a...
Yeah, it's possible to put in the roadmap to do that, but in essence, what we're doing with each proposal is that if it is a proposal that's gone through a governance vote, for instance, because pretty much every proposal should go through a governance vote. If you find a proposal sitting in the executive voting construct and it hasn't gone through a governance vote, well, you know that's not a well-vetted, it's not a well-considered proposal. So by default, it should find itself falling to the wayside. To your point of delegating your vote to someone else, what we're trying to do is we're trying to show proposals that go through the governance vote and get into the executive voting construct that has clear consensus. So when you're voting on it, you don't necessarily have to delegate your vote to someone else, because by default of it being in the executive voting construct, you can assume that the necessary people who know what's going on want it to be there. That's the point I'm trying to make. So essentially, when you vote on the executive on an executive vote, you should be a part of the considerable mass. You should be way past the critical mass. You're way past the tipping point. It's just really a case of how far past the tipping point you want to go with this particular vote. So if we were to, for instance, we want to include token ABC, we go through a governance vote that says yes, we want to include it because it all makes a whole lot of sense. We put the risk parameters in the executive vote. There, you should assume that you would have 80%, 90% buy-in anyway. So your maker token holder that has 0.001 MKR should feel that they are actually voting with the tide. This is not your general election where you kind of have a sense of will we win, will we not win. If it's there and it's gone through the process, it should win. You should be a part of the masses that are facing the right way, with the idea that the incentives are all in place.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. I think that it's something that we need to keep in the back of our minds, that ultimately these proposals are based on models that have been reproducible with open data sets created by experts in the field. So to question them, or for there to be any sort of uncertainty around that is probably going to be unlikely. Uncertainty around the conclusions of the proposal is probably going to be unlikely. And if there is, then that means that there's something deeper at play that requires. Okay, yeah, I'm caught up to you now. That's very interesting. That there's this unlikelihood that it's going to come down to a 50-50 split on any one proposal, or that there needs to be campaigning in order for people to understand what the facts are.
Yeah, I mean that's why, you know, the one thing I always find when I go to governance panels, they talk about everything from liquid democracy to delegated to, you know, obviously delegated voting, to all these constructs that you need to consider. But the underlying construct assumes that the outcome is up in the air. All these constructs are made around representation so that whatever the outcome is fairly represented. Where we're doing it the other way around, and that's what makes MakerDAO such a firm system, is that we're actually making a conclusive outcome and then finding the number of votes over and above the expected critical mass that we need. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but we are increasing the confidence in that self-fulfilling prophecy to the point where when we do vote it in, it should be more a case of, you know, goes without saying, rather than, you know, a point of contention. If there's still contention at the executive voting level, then that proposal should be removed.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's really interesting. Thanks for that clarification. All right. Tom, I know you said you don't...
Sorry, on the governance vote, if if there's a new risk team that wants to produce models for the system, you know, that governance vote may be 50-50. You can introduce them. We can tell the whole system about this new team, and they're wonderful and everything's fantastic. Still, there might be a case that they will not be voted in. But in terms of the executive vote, that is where we basically apply everything we can to make sure that there is a highest probability of that proposal moving through.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, if there is contention, then that means that the system needs to be reevaluated, and we probably shouldn't expect it. So that's really cool. Tom, I know you said don't ask offhand, but I think that's an interesting question. You want to go ahead? You done?
Yeah, sure. It's kind of like a weird question, but you know, if a collateral type gets voted in, like a cryptocurrency or a coin, and it's ingrained in the system, and people are locking it up, and you know, then it gets systemic where it's in new use cases. You know, in the event that that coin would have to get voted out for whatever reason, what's the process for that to happen? I feel like that could be a big.
You don't vote the coin out. You put the debt ceiling to 0.
Got it. Would that have like, you know, lasting effects, or would there be like an unwinding in part of the system in that case? Or, you know, I'm just wondering what would happen.
Well, what you would probably find first that happens is that in the normal course of events, one would assume that this would happen over a period and in a sort of transitional manner. You would sort of find a gradation down to 0. If you have something that is an absolute black swan, out of the blue, complete mess up, it'll just immediately put the debt ceiling down to 0, and then whatever is in the system can only be unwound. You can't add to, and that really is the basis of it.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions for this topic, Stephen, if you wanted to move on.
Sure. Then are there any other questions with respect to previously discussed things in terms of risk, in terms of including collateral types, you know, how we consider it? Because if there isn't, I can start talking more about how to construct the collateral portfolio. So I'm going to give it 10 seconds to see if there's any questions. If not, okay.
Well, I'm just going to jump in really quickly, sorry. We get people from outside the organization, but we always have people from inside as well. And I want to make sure that the people that work at MakerDAO are aware that they can ask questions as well. Like, we'd love to hear from inside the moat as well. So if you guys have anything, feel free to ask. Okay, that's my speech, Steve.
Okay. So the next thing that we need to consider is actually building up the collateral portfolio. Now, the way that I've introduced the risk mechanism and understanding the risks have always been from a per collateral type point of view. So you might have a look at collateral type ABC, you do an assessment on it, and you tell, you find out that the liquidation ratio should be 130%, the debt ceiling should be $65 million, and the stability fee should be 2.3%. That's all good and well. But if we get another collateral type and we work out that its liquidation ratio is 160%, its debt ceiling is $20 million, and its stability fee is 3%, when we combine that into the portfolio, are we actually looking at apples with apples when we compare these two tokens? I mean, does their risk profile standardize to the point where you can actually measure them off against each other and then say to yourself, well, given their risk parameters, is one a better risk than the other? Now, the short answer to that is, well, no, because you've considered them independently. And there isn't an easy way to standardize the comparison between the two. So you kind of need to reformulate how you look at this, because you need to create a collateral portfolio of these guys and not look at things just independently. So what you need to do, and this is kind of like the economic trilemma problem, is that you got to say, well, if I want to have the similar amount of risk exposure to each collateral type, how do I go about doing that? Do I need to maybe make all the debt ceilings the same and then have the liquidation ratio and stability fee change? Or do I need to have all the liquidation ratios the same and let the debt ceilings fluctuate and the stability fee fluctuate? The reason I want to keep something the same, one of the parameters the same, is because you're taking on more or less the same kind of risk to each collateral type. So if we decide that collateral type ABC is 150% liquidation ratio, and from that we consequently calculate that the debt ceiling is 50 million and the stability fee is 2.5%, and then we have a look at another collateral type and we also make its liquidation ratio 150%, and lo and behold, we find that the debt ceiling is 65 million and the stability fee is 2.3%. What we do know now is that even though we've got slightly more potential exposure to the second collateral type, we actually have the same underlying risk to both collateral types. So in the traditional space, in the traditional investment space, there's this notion that when you build your investment portfolio, how do you allocate money to each of the the shares or the assets that you want to include in your portfolio? There's a whole host of literature out there. The one part that's always interesting, and I always try to use, is you have a look at the amount of risk you have and you budget it equally to each asset type. So if you say you're willing to lose $10,000 in risk and you wish to have 10 assets in your portfolio, then you want to have $1,000 of risk budgeted to each asset type. And then that $1,000 then converts into different exposures that you'd have to each of these asset types. And you have varying levels of exposures, but the underlying theory is that each one of these asset types will only bear $1,000 of risk on your allocated budget. In the same way, this is how we're going to construct the collateral portfolio. We're going to have a look at something called economic capital. If you remember what that was, that basically is the amount of for lack of a better word, amount of money that MKR token holders wish to lose over any one period of time, or can will be happy to expose to over a course of 1 year. And then from that, you budget it appropriately to each of the underlying collateral types. This you can do very quantitatively, but the problem being is you have to be very prescriptive in terms of who comes into the collateral portfolio, and at the same time, you've got to be prescriptive in terms of how much comes into the collateral portfolio at any one time. So it kind of doesn't work when you translate the traditional investment tool into this space, because you don't get to choose how much you want at any one time. Your CDP users get to choose that. So there's that sort of business constraint that you've got to consider. But what you have to do is make sure that you equalize the potential risk and then you start off with the debt ceilings and the stability fees with the same risk allocated to each collateral type. And
Can I
then
jump in for a
Sure.
second? So there's a lot of really interesting things there. So you're talking from a high level. We have these three different levers basically that we can pull in order to adjust our exposure of any one particular collateral type. But you also said that ultimately it's up to CDP users to determine exactly how that looks by their usage of each individual asset class. Is it the job of the risk team to help shape the behavior of the CDP users, or is it to respond to their interest by changing something in another area?
So this comes back to the policy instrument component of the stability fee, right? There's two parts to it. There's a part that looks after the system that tries to, if necessary, balance the incongruence between supply and demand of DAI as a whole. And then there's a part of it that looks at a particular collateral type and says, well, in order to induce folks to use this collateral type, we may have to lower the stability fee for that particular collateral type. It's preferable to have that be a price discovery or a market-oriented value, but for the time being, you might find that risk teams will try and manipulate that policy instrument to obviously induce. But at the same time, you can only induce to a certain extent. There is going to be a point where you need to just simply accept that people do not want that collateral type in their portfolio, no matter what you think about it. And if that's the case, you need to either expand your portfolio to include new collateral types, or do an adjustment, an appropriate debt ceiling adjustment for each of those unwanted collateral types. As I said, this is not your normal risk return investment aspect where you're trying to create a portfolio for yourself by allocating funds. This is purely from a risk point of view, purely from mitigating risk and keeping the integrity of the system, the stability of the coin, but also importantly is being cognizant of the business dynamic underlying it as well.
It's really, yeah, it puts a fun spin on it, I guess, from my perspective. Maybe not if you're a risk manager, but you're attempting to balance a portfolio of crypto or stocks that's other people are kind of controlling the influx of, which that sounds a bit terrifying, but
it is terrifying because if you think about it, right now ETH is has a 100 million debt ceiling. Let's say we include another 8, and each of them get 10 million. Just pretend 10 million debt ceiling each. Who knows which collateral is going to hit their debt ceiling first? You don't know. You might find that all of them will, or some of them will, or maybe just one will. The point being is, when you hit the debt ceiling on that particular collateral type, do you then increase the debt ceiling on just that collateral type? Well, the answer is no, because you've adjusted your exposure in terms of equally defined risk. So they all have an equal amount of risk. As soon as you increase that debt ceiling, you are invariably increasing the concentration of risk into one area.
Is there a magical formula that the risk teams are going to come up with, saying that we have like X number of collateral types and here's our 3 levers or 10 levers, and based on how close something is to the debt ceiling, this means we need to do something over in this area? Or does it involve the sort of this constant reevaluation of the portfolio on a daily or weekly basis?
Constant reevaluation, because this is not just a risk team reevaluation, this is also a business team reevaluation. You have to look at what collateral types want to be used as collateral versus the collateral types you wish to be used as collateral. So you have to evaluate it from both points of view. To be completely formulaic is to miss the point that you're actually growing in an economic system. Not only do you have the ability to have collateral types that can be included that are in demand, but MakerDAO, as we all know, is also a flywheel in terms of generating growth for those particular organizations that wish to interact with our system on the blockchain economy. So we have this twofold function. One is to ensure that the collateral types that we want are, we do suck out their safety risk profile and we inject that into the system. But at the same time, we need to be able to also be exposed to their business profile that allows us to develop the system. And that means that participants and specifically MKR token holders need to be very cognizant of the fact that just because we want to include a collateral type that can give us a really large debt ceiling doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get it.
Okay, great. I think that answers my question. I still, the very last point you made, we also don't necessarily want to add any one collateral type that will give us an order of magnitude larger debt ceiling than the others do.
Because we basically, the other thing you got to keep in mind is, with respect to one of our previous community call meetings when I spoke about debt ceiling is constructed from firstly the liquidity profile of the underlying stock, the underlying token, but at the same time there's a hard cap on that figure which represents a percentage of the free float that's out there. So if you find that a certain collateral type starts pushing up the debt ceiling, we have to be cognizant of the fact that, is this going to take us too close to that cap? Because not only do you have a high concentration in terms of your collateral portfolio, but you actually have an exponential increase in risk as you get closer to that cap. Because you're creating more of a liquidity risk for yourself, the greater the exposure you allow in the collateral portfolio. If the price discovery mechanism in the secondary market becomes a lot clearer with a lot more depth and liquidity, then the debt ceiling is, obviously justified. But until then, you got to make sure that you lockstep this approach appropriately, and you may have to keep a debt ceiling in place for a particular collateral type if it has reached it, and allow time for all the other collateral types to catch up. You may not even need to adjust the stability fee. You may find that you are, to a certain extent, coercing folks to say, well, if you want to participate in this, these are the remaining collateral types you need to consider. So we're steering the system towards what we consider to have the better stability, as opposed to what people just want to use, which may actually deter or be a detriment from the underlying stability.
Okay, I get it. So the risk teams are stewards of the system, but they also need to remain responsive to the system, and they also need to remain cognizant of what the greater crypto world is up to and anticipate things that might be coming down the pipe.
Yep.
That's really, wow, that's crazy. All right, Tom, you had a question. We've talked about this question you have a couple times, but it's a good one. So if you want to go ahead and ask it again, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, it's first time on here. But Steven, how do you incentivize the risk teams to stay on and long term?
Oh, very difficultly is the answer. It's not a. You got to keep in mind that right now we are. I don't know if you've heard my analogy. MakerDAO is like a battleship, and we are busy building this battleship in port. And right now, all the folks that are contributing to this battleship are effectively service providers. But once MakerDAO is completely deployed onto the blockchain, it is very much like a battleship out in ocean. And then you've got to consider all the sailors, being the MKR token holders, they got to think to themselves, okay, who do we want to pick to provide services for us as MakerDAO? And the folks that we pick, well, they're either going to come with a bill of their own, or we're going to have a suggested way that we should pay them. Now, consider that MakerDAO may require people to program front ends, or increase the transparency, or better the governance, or do specific accounting, or look after risk, or become a better oracle. All these things are an inherent cost that folks need to consider for the system, because that cost is inherently the function that makes the system work. And you can't steer away from that cost. You will always need that sort of cost to a certain extent. And when we have new risk teams voted in, those risk teams are not going to come just because, gee whiz, this is a fun thing to do. They're going to come with very specific incentives. They'll either do it for free because what they're ultimately doing is looking after their huge MKR holding, or they will do it for a certain charge because they are really good at it, even though they have no MKR holding whatsoever. So
will we try to balance that mix? Will we want sort of this for hire versus stakeholder mix, or does it matter?
That mix is really dependent on what. Here's the thing that it was very hard for me to get my head around. But as soon as you start asking these questions about service provision to MakerDAO, you got to consider this from the point of view of MKR token holders. It's what they want. So the best thing we can do right now is educate everyone as much as possible and make YouTube and podcast programs like this for people to reference to in the future, so they understand what their responsibility is. And their responsibility is including new risk teams, because that's the way it's going to make the system better. But it's also their responsibility to decide when a risk team actually is a risk team that you want to hire, or if a risk team is just merely a representation of a large holding or a strategic interest in the system. You can't get rid of them because they might have a specific bias. You've got to include them because you need a spectrum of biases. You need a spectrum of points of view, because they will ultimately come into an aggregate form that should, through the so-called wisdom of the crowd, benefit the system as a whole. That's ultimately what you want to do. So do you pay for risk teams? Once again, it's an idea in your mind that you need to ask another person if they're considering paying for risk teams. This is not another person. You've got to ask yourself as an MKR token holder, do you want to pay a risk team?
Okay, sorry. That's a great discussion. I think that we're going to have it again in the future, because I'm still trying to wrap my head around incentivizing third-party groups of MakerDAO actors, and the risk teams is one of the most interesting ones to me. So hopefully we'll revisit that again. Yeah, we have 7 minutes left. Okay. Do you think we should move into another topic, or what do you want to do?
Well, there's, as you said, 7 minutes left. If there are any lasting questions, we can answer them. If there's any interesting topics anybody wants to bring up, let's do that now. But I don't think we have time for a new topic. And Tom, I think people are dropping off. They're going back.
Yeah, we're getting close to the end of the hour. Tom, you had another great question. Thanks for providing so much useful content to us. You want to ask about the liquidation ratios?
Yeah, sure. So, Steven, do you think that there's any way to maybe use like crypto, how correlated the crypto assets are between themselves when you're figuring out these liquidation ratios? Like how correlated Bitcoin is to Ethereum and all of that?
Yeah, so when you obviously create any kind of portfolio whatsoever, you do need to consider what your overall risk looks like, and you do that through the mechanism of calculating your standard deviation using your covariance matrix, right? It's a basic construct. So yes, it is considered, because ultimately you want to know what the portfolio as a whole is doing, not necessarily the individuals. So from a value at risk point of view, from the massive amounts of literature out there, you've got things called marginal value at risk, conditional value at risk, and these things really start helping you define what collateral types you should include in your portfolio given the current state of your portfolio. So I'll give you an example. There's a big difference. If you included ETH into your portfolio, which we have, does that mean that does that mean that the next item you should use is Bitcoin if you're looking for diversification? Well, the short answer is, well, no, because they got a decent amount of correlation. But then when you have a look at all the other crypto tokens in the space, you realize that they've got pretty much more or less the same correlation anyway. So you kind of stuck with this idea of either waiting for tokens to develop that are clearly orthogonal and clearly not correlated, and which you want to include into your portfolio, or what you need to do is go take a lot of these tokens that may have high correlation but give them low debt ceilings, because your diversification benefit is always there, and you can, it's not fantastic, it's not the hugest diversification benefit in the world, but it is always there, and the more collateral types you can add on, the more diversification benefit you can create. Again, the marginal increase may not be huge, but the point being is we don't really have a plethora of options right now. We are kind of constrained. So to deal with that constraint is to broaden the number that we use and decrease the debt ceiling, so we're not overexposed to what is clearly, from a portfolio point of view, something that is particularly correlated. But using, I mean, if you're mathematically inclined, you can have a look at return optimization and risk optimization using Lagrangian multipliers, and that gives you a good sense of how you need to allocate in order to achieve these objectives. And within that calculation, you obviously need to use covariance matrices, which, by the way, if you are so inclined, keep in mind that covariance matrices are themselves a statistic, which means you need to bootstrap it and keep in mind that over time they evolve.
Super interesting. Thanks, Steven.
Okay, that's 3 minutes left, so maybe we can put an end to the proceedings here. I think that today's meeting was amazing. And also a special thank you to Tom, because I just noticed that you've been live tweeting the meeting as we've gone along, and that's enormously valuable. So I appreciate that. Thank you. That earns you a retweet for sure. So I'll get to it after the call. All right, thanks everybody. This will be up on YouTube presently and SoundCloud, and I'll put a link to it in our subreddit. So thanks everyone for showing up.
Thanks everyone. Thank you very much, Tom. Appreciate that.
Talk to you all next week.